I often use vintage lenses on modern cameras. My go-to is the Hasselblad V-Series lenses. When you use these lenses, you're almost always dealing with a crop factor. That is, the focal length of the lens will appear to increase or decrease depending on the size of the sensor. I've always just believed the crop sizes that are given are correct, but I'm not sure they are. Also, we see a change in the depth of field when we use these lenses on different sensor sizes. How much does the depth of field really change? I really don't know. That's what I'm hoping to find out today.
So what we're going to do at first is shoot with the 150 on the 35mm full frame. We know what that's going to look like. We're familiar with that. And then we're going to move and shoot with the different crop sizes. And this one has approximately a 0.8. So our 150 then turns into a 120. This is a 0.6. And so that's a 90. And this is a 1.6. So 240. So this lens will react very differently from the 90 here to the 240. The first thing we're interested in is really the crop size. Then we're also going to look at the perceived depth of field. We understand, obviously, that the lens is giving us the same depth of field no matter what camera it's on. But our perception will change because on this, it should, and this is the part I'm really interested in, it should look like the depth of field is very small. On this camera, we should be seeing a much bigger depth of field. And then these two would be somewhere in between. So that, I always believe that from using these, I just intuitively believe, but I've never proved it to myself. So that's what I'm trying to do today.
Here's the 4 images. The first thing I notice is the color difference. The RAW files have all been opened in Adobe Camera Raw, and the white balance set to daylight. The second thing I noticed is the amount of contrast difference. Again, these have been slightly adjusted in Camera Raw, but the same adjustments were applied to all 4 photos. Surprisingly to me, that means the RAW file can look very different based on how the manufacturer writes the raw data. Something I guess I kind of knew, but didn't see it this clearly. The crop size is about what I expected. However, looking at it now, I really noticed the sensor aspect ratio difference. The aspect ratio of the Blackmagic is Super 35, stands out. It's radically different than the traditional cameras. Funny because when I shoot with that camera, I really never notice it. Even shooting still photographs, the camera just feels normal. But seeing it here, you can really see how wide it is. This is what the crop factors or ratios are supposed to be. When you look at it, the size is quite striking.
Now let's look at the depth of field that we were talking about earlier. And for this, the easier way I think to do it is to use these cameras, same lens, and make it so that the scene is always about the same size. In other words, I'll move back and forth with my tripod and the camera and try to get the exact same image, size-wise. So what I'm going to do is there's a bar on the fence, and I am basically going to try to make that go from the top to the bottom of the screen or the viewfinder and shoot the picture. We may be off a little here or there, but that's really not that important. And what that should allow us to do is to look at these in sequence and see if the reality is this does have a shorter depth of field, and this one looks like it's got a much bigger depth of field.
As I walked up closer and closer to get the similar image, it really struck me what a difference these sensor sizes are making. This is interesting. If you look at the fence, you can see exactly what is happening. Honestly, it's easier to see in the Fujifilm versus Hasselblad pictures than the others. You can see the Fujifilm depth of field runs well past the sign. Here, The Hasselblad stops at about the same. The other thing I find interesting is how sharp the medium format sensors are compared to the smaller sensors. The other place you can really notice the depth of field is in the rocks. When you look at the rocks from the Super 35, they look like rocks. From the Hasselblad, they're a blob. The one thing I would say, the advantage of the larger depth of field is offset a bit by the sharpness of the larger sensors.
Oh, hello. I thought that was going to take a little longer. Sorry about that. So now what we're going to do, I think, is go ahead and using different lenses on all of the cameras that approximate the same look, we will take the same photo over and over and over. And the idea here is, you know, you always think the biggest sensor is the one you should be using. And what I kind of find is that I don't always like to use the biggest sensor. A lot of times I actually like to use the smaller sensor. It gives me kind of a more dramatic look at times. The properties of this are very interesting in that when you use a super wide angle lens on it, things seem to go into the distance forever. Where here, it really pulls it out. So let's take a quick look at that. And what we're going to be using is, on the Fuji, we're going to use a 23 millimeter. So that's that. On the 35, we're going to use a 17 millimeter. This one happens to be a tilt shift. Then on the Super 35 sensor, we're going to use a 10 millimeter. And that should look basically all the same. And then over here on the Hasselblad, we're going to use a 28 millimeter. So all of those should mimic the look of this 17 fairly closely. 17 to 18 is what we should get out of this effectively. Anyway, so let's go take a look at that, and I'll go back to drinking my water.
Okay, this is kind of interesting too. Look at the colors again. All of a sudden, the traditional cameras look closer to the same color. These were shot with better lenses. The Blackmagic was used with a less expensive lens. I'm guessing the coatings on the lenses are what's giving us the color shift. Again, these were all raw files processed as daylight. The other thing I would say is that the known crop sizes, say 1.6, is way off when you look at the aspect ratio. You can see the Super 35 is really wide without much height. It's also interesting to look at the contrail and how it moves up the frame as we get to greater lens distortion. I'm not sure I learned anything from this test. However, I do see why I think the Super 35 feels more dramatic. The aspect ratio fools us.
Okay, so I'm assuming you all know how lens adapters work. If they're smart lenses, there'll be some electronics connections on this side and some electronic connections on this side, and they will convert what you're seeing here to what you're seeing there. So what the camera thinks is happening is also happening on the lens. That's why a lot of times the autofocus or something like that won't work, but you may get metadata still running through. Well, when you have a lens this old, obviously there's no electronics on it, so these can be fairly stupid. They are just truly straight through adapters. This is the one for the 35 millimeter. This is the one for the GFX. And they are just straight through adapters. And you can see the width of them is basically to make sure that this lens is at the right distance from where the film would be, or in this case, our sensor. So that's that. Then for the Hasselblad, they had one that actually worked with their lenses. And the reason for that is the Hasselblad has the shutter in the lens here, not in the camera. And in the new cameras, it was the same way. So whether it was film or the current cameras, they don't put their shutters in the camera, it is in the lens. There's a benefit to that, and there's also a drawback to that, but it doesn't really matter. That's a design issue that they have decided on. So when you put this on here, it will actually mount, and we should be able to see right through it. And when this clicks, the shutter inside the lens will actually actuate and shut. Something that it won't do with these. Here, we're using the shutter in the camera for our shutter speed. This is really just setting our aperture, and we're doing that in a live view, in essence, because if we're down here, we need to manually shut the shutter to where we want it to be before we take the picture, because it will not adjust automatically. So again, it's a time, it's you can't be in a rush with this stuff. But I love these vintage lenses because they do give a certain look that I don't think current lenses give, in that they have imperfections. They were done by hand. When you think of current lenses, even the cheapest ones are computer made, virtually perfect. These things, and then over years, other problems have happened. This one's got a big old Guju in the back. Doesn't seem to affect the pictures. I've, even at f32, not been able to see it, but I'm sure there is a little distortion that happens, and I personally enjoy that. The other thing is they're nowhere near as sharp as a current lens. The sharpness, just, they didn't care quite as much in film days, because the film was never totally flat. And so a little bit of that softness was just part of film, and is part of film. I shoot quite a bit of film still, and it is truly a different look. The problem with these is that, again, film was much more forgiving when there was lens flare and that kind of thing. So they did not put as much coating on here as they do in today's lenses. Today they actually coat the back of the lens usually as well as the front of the lens to reduce that lens flare. So one of the things you're going to see if you use these vintage lenses is a great deal more lens flare. You'll notice a lot of times on mine, and in fact you'll see there's an adapter on here, that I'll have a polarizer on there all the time, because the flare can just drive you nutty. Other times I'll take it off because I really want that flare, and it can create some dramatic effects. But yeah, for the most part, it's a lot of fun. They're very slow, kind of cumbersome, and perfect for the way I shoot. Anyway, I hope we learned something today. I really don't know yet, because I haven't seen half the video that you've already looked at. I got to get these cards unloaded and see what they look like. See you next time.